After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the adult and family psychology, learn about the power, authority, and discretionary decision making, police as mediators in domestic disputes. Now, introduction. Adult psychology. Traditionally, the fields of law enforcement and psychology have made for strange, if not strange, bedfellows. Policing, by its very nature, requires that officers necessarily and responsibly exercise restraints and caution, be alert and suspicious, and expert power and force where suitable. Psychologically, by in turn, inspires significant honesty, reflection, and self examination. In short, the protect and serve function of policing does not seem easily assimilable with the touch feely sentiment of psychology. This notwithstanding, there are certainly a number of instances where the tools of psychology helps officers interface with the public. Perhaps nowhere else is the tension between law enforcement and psychology more evident than in the adult forensic arena. In this, five subjects and or disagreements are inspected, exploring diverse surfaces of this connection. These issues controversies include power, authority, and discretionary decision making, the use of force, evidence tampering, adult criminal profiling, and correlated confessions. Evidently, there are various domains in which the psychological sciences influence the preparation of policing through the particular topics were continuously chosen as the collected recommended significant extent in forensic application. The adult prison population represents society with a complex set of matters and arguments needing considerate, practicable, and operative responses. The assorted tools of the psychological sciences and the law are increasingly called upon to make sense out of difficult correctional questions affecting the lives of prisoners and the community of which they are a part. Thus, not only are the expertise of the forensic professionals applied for determinations of assessing, detecting, and considering convicts, they are also employed for purpose of apprehensive the correctional milieu itself. Family psychology. Family psychology denotes to how the psychological sciences can be used to recognize the way in which the police officers addresses domestic dilemmas in their own lives or in lives of citizens suspected. Incarceration drastically impacts families. Correctional psychologists examine where and how persons in and out of the institution cope with the emotional pain that comes from separation, loss, shame, loneliness, and the like when a family member is criminally confined. Thus, similar to the preceding chapter, the civil, forensic, and corrections, family forensic investigations, many of the social, interpersonal, and intra-psychic variables that give rise to expert psychological practice in penal facilities. People have the fundamental needs to express intimacy and affection. The same is the true for person in prison, especially women. One response to this need is to create make-believe families. What emotional need to do surrogate or play families fill for mother in prison? What specific roles do prisoners assume in these kindship systems? How do pseudo families operate in the correctional milieu? Some women in prison prior to and once confined get pregnant. What health and mental health care services are provided to integrate pregnant women? What health and mental health care services are available to adolescent girls in your facilities? What are the constitutional limits to receiving such medical treatment? What is the emotional impact to women receiving minimum parental and newborn infant care while incarcerated? Many female prisoners are mothers. What are the emotional and health care consequences to both mothers and their children when the parent is incarcerated? How do children deal with the worry of parting? How can forensic psychologists help comfort the pain of parting caused by the criminal confinement. Other family members, such as a spouse, are also traumatized by the incarceration of a loved one. Loneliness, depression, and anxiety are just a few of the symptoms experienced by many spouses. What facilities exist to address these psychological problems? What support work is being done to progress the criteria for prison visitation by family member? Mother in prison represent a special group of offender. Who are they demographically? Is there a personality profile for this offender group? To what extent do mothers in prison feel shame, guilt, and grief as a result of their criminal life choice? How do they cope with the grief that comes from the loss of parental bonding and parenting? At the intersection of corrections, psychology, and family studies are an array of issues and controversies affecting the lives of persons incarcerated and their loved ones. Now, power, authority, and discretionary decision making, adult psychology. Effective law enforcement must take into account the encompass a wide variety of processes and decision making steps. Officers must decide whether to arrest an individual given a citation or simply release a citizen with a warning. These decisions, however, are never cut and dried, and often they fail to be consistent. An officer's decision in handling a situation depends on the offense, the background and the personality of the responding officer, and the demographic background of the offender. This section discusses the discretionary decision making process with law enforcement, drawing on the officer's perceived or giving power and authority to make law enforcing decisions. The following scenario is commonplace, deals with alternating forms of police discretion, and is a typical complaint of citizens. While driving down an interstate, you are pulled over by a police officer. The officer, upon reaching your car, begins to discuss with you in a somewhat stern voice the rules and regulations of the route and every way in which you have violated them. To your dismay, you are informed that you are receiving a ticket to which you may plead guilty or not guilty and will be required to pay a hefty fine. You are told by a friend of yours that they too were pulled over just yesterday on the same interstate. However, you are surprised to discover that this friend did not receive a ticket and in fact was released without even a warning. Upon further discussion, you also discover that you were clocked at the same speed and were pulled over the same arena of interstate. You can't help but wonder why you received a citation and your friend did not. Was it because you are significantly younger than your friend, or was it because you are of different race or sex? Aggravated, you complain to all who will listen about and lack of fairness and consistency in traffic ticket citations. Scenarios such as these have been the subject of controversies for some time now. Police as mediators in domestic disputes, adult psychology. Domestic violence has occurred and even become condoned among cultural throughout history. The fact, the often heard phrase rule of thumb actually refers to the old practice that a man could not beat his spouse with an object greater than the width of his thumb. It is undisputable that domestic violence is a universal social problem and affects not only victims and their criminals but also the police with a delicate, expressively laden, and often debatable subject. The following case illustration is a typical yet compelling scenario of a domestic violence situation. An officer is patrolling in his squad car when he receives a call from a dispatch to respond to a complaint of domestic violence. The officer recognizes the address and mumbles to himself in an irritating manner, "Why should I ever bother to respond? This address with the same complaint has occurred numerous times since his joining the police force some 13 years ago." This scenario happens about once a month. Typically, a complaint is received from Mrs. once that her husband is being verbally and often physically abusive and that she requires assistance immediately. However, each time an officer confronts his situation, Mrs. Jones refuses to cooperate with the arresting or prosecuting procedures, stating that her call to the police was premature, a mistake, and does not wish to prosecute despite her blackened eye and bruised cheeks. Often, Mr. Jones is not present in the home, making it a waste of valuable time to try and find him. Situations such as these are commonplace for the police officers who respond to domestic violence calls. Depending on the policy and procedures of the police department jurisdiction, officers are instructed to deal with these situations differently. Some law enforcement departments have a mandatory arrest policy for the perpetrators as well as the victim. In a time of increased public concern and increased police involvement, officers are faced with the task of having to handle domestic disputes via mandatory arrest or through mediation. A significant amount of literature exists on the dynamics, cause, prevention strategies, policing methods, and other topics related to the subject. Mediators are most often police officers who deal with these types of situations on a daily basis. The focus of this section is on the role of police officers as mediators in domestic disputes. A variety of aspects related to mediation in domestic dispute is examined, including police practices and tactics, existing policies regarding offenders, recommendations, and prevention strategies. Now, the family trauma and the cycle of the crime. An increasing number of children are living in chaotic familial and communal environment. Conservative estimates indicate that over 1 million children are abused and neglected each year in the United States alone. These children are often exposed to exorbitant levels of trauma characterized by parental neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and inconsistent discipline from parental figures. The biological, physiological, and social repercussions of children growing up with such trauma are numerous. Of course, particular interest, however, is the significance of family trauma and its relation to the intergenerational cycles of antisocial and criminal behavior. The relationship between one traumatic upbringing and the perpetuation of the criminal behavior in adolescence and adulthood has been clearly noted in the literature. Empirical evidence does not suggest that the growing number of adolescent and adult criminal offenders come from backgrounds plagued with varying levels of trauma. However, currently there are no concentrated efforts made to address these issues in terms of prevention and effective intervention measures. The following cases illustrate how a young male who lived in a chaotic familial environment resorted to violence. 15-year-old Arnold was arrested and incarcerated after he fatally stabbed his mother boyfriend of 2 months. As a young child, Arnold has been exposed to numerous distressing events. On many occasions, he observed Arnold's father physically abused him and often used objects such as belts, electric cords, and wooden planks. As a young child, Arnold was left alone in the house for days at a time without any guidance or supervision. Subsequently, Arnold began having numerous difficulties both at home and at school. His teachers reported that during class he seemed distracted and he would often engage in physical interactions with other classmates. He began to exhibit increasingly dangerous and reckless behaviors, spoke about weapons, stabbing, and the physical abuse he had witnessed, and expressed vague fears that he himself would come to harm others. The night of the stabbing, Arnold witnessed his mother and her boyfriend arguing in a living room. Arnold was unable to tolerate his mother's boyfriend's argumentative behavior and hence Arnold impulsively reached for a kitchen knife and proceeded to stab him. Arnold was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, is currently awaiting sentencing. Now, family violence, homicide. When most people think of violence, they think of an innocent victim being attacked by a total stranger. The media exacerbates these fears by depicting the perpetrator as an unidentifiable psychopath that sneak around hunting for prey, an obvious means of avoiding contact with such a person is to stay away from the bad neighborhoods where such crimes are more likely to occur. The safe place to be the confines of your own home behind locked doors and set alarms. The reality, though, is that the risk of dying at the hand of an acquaintance or family members far exceeds the threatening of being killed by a complete stranger. Familial violence, more specifically familial homicide, is much more common than most people would like to believe. This section explores the various forms of familial homicide such as battered woman, infanticide, and Munchausen disorder by proxy, parasite, familicide, and the causal factors that lead to such incidents. According to the 1994 Bureau of Justice Static Report focusing on murders within families, 16% of all murders committed in 1988 were committed against family members. The breakdown of these findings indicate that 6.5% of the victims are murdered by their spouse, 3.5 by parents, 1.9 were killed by their children, 1.5 were victims of stabbing violence, and another 2.6 were victimized by other family members. The following vignette is an illustration of family violence. After an exhausting day of caring for the children, cleaning the house, and working at her part time job, Carla was lying down for a quick nap. Sleeping a bit longer than expected, Carla was late preparing dinner. When her husband Charlie came home, he was infuriated by her tardiness, laziness, and insensitivity to his need. He had just lost a big contract at work and did not appreciate her lack of consideration. Feeling it his obligation to set her straight, which he had continuously done in the past, Charlie picked up a pot of boiling water from the stove and threw it in Carla's face. Screaming for help, Carla charged toward the door where Charlie proceeded to hit her over the head with the pot. Carla died 3 days later from a subdural hepatoma. Now, the summary. Psychology, by in turn, inspires significant honesty, reflection, and self examination. In short, the protect and severe function of policing does not seem easily accessible with the touch freely sentiment of psychology. Family forensic denotes to how the psychological sciences can be used to recognize the way in which police officers addresses domestic dilemmas in their own lives or in the lives of citizens suspect. Officers must decide whether to arrest an individual, give a citation, or simply release a citizen with a warning. These decisions, however, are never cut and dried and often they fail to be consistent. The relationship between one traumatic upbringing, the perpetuation of criminal behavior, and adolescence and adulthood has been clearly noted in the literature. Mediators are most often police officers who deal with this type of situation on a daily basis. The focus of this section is on the role of police officers as mediators in domestic disputes.